I'd like to introduce Lieutenant General Jim Richardson, who recently retired from the U.S. Army after a very distinguished 39-year career. He's a master Army aviator who specializes in Apache attack helicopters with more than 4,000 flight hours and 2,000 of those in combat. He had 7 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and has also served in South Korea, Kuwait, and the United States. And his last assignment was as acting commander of Army Futures Command, from which he retired last November. General Richardson, thank you so much for being with us here at CMIST. We're thrilled to have you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation over the next hour or so. I can't wait to talk to you about all the different aspects of your experience and also everything about the Army and technology and the things that we're building here at Carnegie Mellon University and how we can work together well. So I want to thank you really for being here in Pittsburgh with us and also for being a distinguished visitor and fellow here at Carnegie Mellon Institute for Security and Technology. So
well,
thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Audrey. It's great to be here, and I'm excited today to be here. This is a wonderful university. I've had a lot of experience in working with this university over the past 3 or 4 years, and it's just an honor to be here and be able to have a conversation with you today.
I'm really looking forward to it. Well, I thought that we might do a kind of a loosely chronological approach in our conversation. You've had so much experience, and there's been so many changes over the course of the last 39 years. So I thought maybe we should start from the beginning. Why did you decide to be an Army officer?
Well, I came from humble beginnings. I grew up. My father was a former Marine. And in the National Guard. And, when I went to college, that was not my goal to be in the service. As I was around people and got to know people, I joined Army ROTC. And it was a great experience for me. I saw the Army provided an education. I liked, the service, to your nation. And I thought service to our nation was extremely important, that I should serve. I thought I was going to be in the Army for 4 years and out, and 40 years later. That just tells you about the organization. And in the end, it's about the people. And so that's what really got me started in the Army. And I love what I did. I was able to fly, as you say, the AH-64. And you got to love your job. You got to love the people, and it was it was phenomenal. I just loved it.
So, how do you think the Army has changed? For
wow.
a young Jim Richardson that's thinking about a career in the Army now, compared to when you went in, how do you think it's different?
Well, let's talk about 1982 when I entered the Army. We didn't have the cell phone in 1982, right? There was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as a computer. We didn't have a copying machine. And it sounds crazy, but things were really different back then. The values of the Army really didn't change, the character of war, etc. But the Army did change over time. And I think the Army changed for better. We are technologically driven today, Army. I spent the last 4 or 5 years of my career, focused on that. But I think the Army changed for the good, from women in the Army. My wife's in the Army, as I'm sure we'll talk about that. Things have changed from that perspective for the Army, all for the good. The diversity of the Army. The Army is probably the most diverse organization in the United States of America. And, I think the Army's changed. The Army back then was hard. It was, physically demanding. If you didn't, if you weren't physically fit, excessive physically fit, it was different. The standards, I think, back then were not as high. I would hate to have to compete with the kids coming in the Army today.
You really think the standards are not as high back then?
I know, because you got to remember, we had just ended Vietnam.
Ah, yes, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
And we had just become an all-volunteer force.
Mm.
As a young lieutenant coming into the Army, taking my first platoon, 70% of my soldiers were Vietnam veterans. They were draftees into the United States Army. It was not a professional force then. And since then, we have become a professional force, an all-volunteer force. The standards are higher today. I can remember back then that if you had a GED, or a lot of people back then, it was either, you go to court, the judge says you either go to jail or you go in the Army. And we were not a professional Army back then. But since then, we have come so far. I mean, the standards for the Army and the, I go visit the ROTCs all the time, and the lieutenants. I could have never competed with the ROTC cadets and the West Point cadets today. I really couldn't, because everybody I talked to, they got a 3.8 or a 4.0 in electrical engineering, or these degrees that and just smart, in shape, just some really, really good people today. And I think the Army's come a long way in the last 40 years.
So you feel like the all-volunteer force has been overall very good? Because some people argue that it's drawn the Army away from the population, and that families tend to go into the Army or into the other services one generation after another, but we're not reaching across the population.
That's true. And that is you are absolutely right. 60% of our Army, it's a family affair. My father, my mother, my aunt, my uncle, my grandfather, they were in the Army. And it becomes a family affair. And if you look at the statistics around the Army, what part of, I would say like 50%, 65, 50, I can't remember. The percentages are not accurate, but it's a high percentage of the Army comes from the southeast of the United States. And so how do you diversify? How do you get out and get away from this family affair? And it's having an impact on recruiting. Mm-hmm. But you're right in what you're saying.
So how do we fix this recruitment problem? The Army has a pretty serious problem, doesn't it?
It does. It does. I would, what is the problem? Why is the Army not meeting its recruiting numbers? And we missed our numbers last year when I was in the Army by 15%. And obviously, when you can't meet your numbers, you reduce your force structure. But the Army's got to start doing things differently than it did. There's a different generation. When I was coming up, the recruiting was in the strip malls.
Yes. Right?
You remember that?
Yes.
They would come to the high school. That's not the way our young adults, do things today. They're on the internet. They're,
on their phones.
Or they're on their phones. So how do you reach out to them? And you've also got to reach out to their parents, right? Because their parents have a lot to say. And, we've been through 20 years of war. And the parents have seen what that does to a family, right? What it could possibly do to an individual. And like, you brought up that I hadn't even thought of, the effect of COVID and what it had on the civilian population. So the Army does have a problem. I spoke to the Secretary of the Army. I had dinner with her a couple of weeks ago, and her entire conversation, was on recruiting, and that is her number one priority. That is the Chief of Staff of the Army's number one priority, because it's about the people.
Especially the Army. Yeah,
it's about the people, and so the Army's working through that. They're coming up with a lot of initiatives to draw young adults into the Army, whether it's, education benefits. They're either looking at tax benefits, except for the I believe for the families. They're coming up with they've got a task force established. They're really putting a lot of emphasis on recruiting because it's extremely important to our nation.
Well, so how would you respond to the arguments of people who say we're coming out of two wars? We've come out of them, and the United States has always had its army go up and down. You know, that's the tradition, at least in the 20th century.
Right.
You know, to rapidly mobilize,
Right.
and then to shrink down in the aftermath of conflict. So, you know, what would you say to the argument that this is normal?
Well, some people would say it's normal. You know, you're right. If you look back in history, that's exactly what we have done. In 1982, when I came in the Army, there was 1.1 million men and women on active duty, not National Guard or Reserve. There was 1.1 million on active duty. Today, there's 465,000. Think about that.
Less than half.
Right. And if you go to any, you know, technology is not going to win wars. People win wars. Right? You've got to have boots on the ground. And so it's going to be extremely important that we maintain our numbers. Do I think, you know, when you look at our strategy, you know, you look at the environment today, you know, China's a competitor, right?
Yes.
Russia's a competitor. You got to watch out for Iran, right? North Korea. So if you look around, look at the current operating environment today, and who's the threat that you've got to be able to counter, you've got to be able. You win wars by deterring wars. You know, you don't want to go to war. If you have a strong military, you will deter those countries from entering into war and us having to go to war. So a strong military is extremely important as we go forward. And in order to have a strong military, yes, technology plays into this, but the people, it's all about the people. And having the right people in the right jobs to, you know, defend our nation.
Well, one of the things that Carnegie Mellon specializes in is understanding that relationship between people and technology.
Right.
Human-computer interaction and a lot of other aspects of that. So I think you'd get a lot of resonance with that point of view here. But if you're talking about China, you know, China is a friend in the sense that we have a lot of economic ties, and then it's also a pacing threat.
Right.
I guess that's the phrase, right? But the PLA, just by the nature of the Chinese population, is always going to be bigger than our army. So, you know, how do you determine exactly how big the army should be?
Right. Well, good question. You know, when you look at the Chinese army, they're bigger. They're twice the size of the United States Army. And when you look at the area that they're operating in, you know, the Pacific, it is 3 times the depth and width that we have to operate in. So how do you deter China, a conflict with China? You deter that by you may not have the numbers, but you have better equipment. You have better people. And they know that. Technology plays extremely important in a conflict, you know, deterring a conflict with China. That's why I'm so excited being here. And the students and the technology and the education that Carnegie Mellon brings to the services and the people that they bring is second to none. But I always say technology is not going to win wars, but technology is probably going to help prevent wars. I believe, you know, with AI, with robotics, you know, autonomy, etc. I mean, China's focusing on that. So are we. You know, when you look at the Army coming from Army Futures Command, we had 9 priority research areas, and I would tell you that Carnegie Mellon probably fits into 5 of the 9. Probably one of the best in the world at it. And I'm just looking forward. But technology is going to play a role. I think this university could play a role in helping deter other nations with that. And so, you know, that's why I'm here.
Excellent. And we're so glad to have you here. Before we turn, I do want to talk a lot more about Army Futures Command because of your crucial role in standing it up, working with General Murray. But in any case, before we pivot to that, I wanted to ask you about your marriage, just briefly. Your wife, Laura Richardson, is a 4-star, and she's commander of Southern Command. And you've had an incredible career, the two of you. Weren't you the only married couple with 3 stars on, with
Yes.
each spouse? So can you just reflect upon what it was like to try to go through your career together? I mean, there must have been points of competition, points of stress. I mean, areas where it was easy or hard. Anything that you can advise young people who are facing that kind of situation?
Right. Well, my wife is a 4-star general. She is a combatant commander in United States Southern Command. She and I grew up with similar backgrounds. I grew up playing sports. She's an 8-time All-American swimmer.
Wow.
I remember I was in the captain's career course, and she was in flight school at the time, so she was 3 years behind me. And we got together, and we grew up with a similar background. We were both very competitive in sports, right? We both won, we both lost, but what we understood is you can't progress without being a team, and that's what sports taught us back then. It's all about teamwork. We got married. We went to Korea. We had a daughter there in Korea, and I was 3 years ahead of her. So Laura obviously was very observant. She used to get, I would always take the jobs before us on the progression up through the Army. So she got to see what I did well in. She got to see the mistakes. She got to see what went.
So you were the guinea pig.
I was the guinea pig. I was the guinea pig. But, and then, we were able to communicate. So when we came home at night, we understood what each other was going through, and she had strengths and weaknesses, and I had strengths and weaknesses, and we filled the gap, and we were able to communicate with that. I would tell you that I would not be where I was today without her. And I think sometimes she may not admit it, but she may not be a 4-star where, without me.
Oh, I'm sure she would admit it.
Yeah, but it was an interesting career. And I will tell you that as you move through the service, whether it's civilian life or in the military, there's give and take. You have probably some families will be A+ personalities on both sides, and they have goals and objectives that they want to achieve. And sometimes those timelines and the location and what you're doing may not fit very nicely. And a lot of people will think, well, I need to stop. I need to have a family. Let this person be the breadwinner, but that's not the case. You don't have to do that. I mean, it's hard. It's very hard. I mean, when we had physical training every morning at 6:30 in the morning, we're taking my daughter to the babysitter at 5:30 in the morning, picking her up at 7, in the evening. Deploying with, my daughter would have to stay with her grandparents. A lot of times Laura and I would deploy separately, which helped. But it does have some effect. The combat had some effect. But I will tell you that it was difficult, but it was so rewarding because at night we knew what each other were going through, and we were able to help each other in life. And so it was just, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Was there separation? Yes, there's separation, especially when you get up in the general officer community. But it's all about team helping each other. It's not, everybody, if you talk to people in the Army, they'll say Jim and Laura are probably one of the most competitive people they ever met. But we were not competitive against each other. And so we tried to help each other. And it doesn't matter if you're in the military, if you're in the civilian world, there are people, similar careers, 2 careers, the families, and it can be done. But some of you sometime are going to have to sacrifice. I sacrificed sometime in my career for Laura, and sometimes Laura sacrificed for me. But in the end, it all worked out. And I tell you what, it's just amazing when, it's a family affair in our family. And I'm so proud of her, attaining the rank of 4-star, being the second woman in the history of the Army to achieve that rank, being the first, second combatant commander as well as a female. That's a big deal. That says something to the young girls and the ladies coming up today that you can do it. And oh, by the way, if you're married and you have a spouse, the teamwork's going to help you there. And so it's really great to have, people always comment about how does it feel to you to be at the time to be a 3-star and your wife to be a 4-star. And I said, well, she's been in charge for 37 years, so it really doesn't matter. But I'm very proud of Laura and all of her accomplishments and what she's done.
Any particular moments of strength or difficulty in all of that you want to share?
Many moments, and I talked to you about one aspect. We all have goals, a career path in the Army that we have to take. We have to knock these jobs out as we go. And I was ahead of Laura. And in order for me to make lieutenant colonel and become a battalion commander, which is a goal in the Army that you set when you come in, that you can lead a battalion, there was, Laura got selected to be Vice President Gore's military aide. So she had to leave Fort Campbell and move to Washington, D.C. She took my daughter with her. Lauren. Right? I stayed at Fort Campbell because I had just taken the job that I always wanted to get me to the next level. And a week later, after she got to Washington, I got orders to move to Washington. And I was like, okay, got it. I'm supposed to, there's give and take. But I was upset. When I got those orders, I didn't understand how all of a sudden I got orders. I think that she had something to do with it. But she wanted to keep the family together. And I thought it was going to be a detriment to my career. But lo and behold, it wasn't. Actually, it was the best thing that ever happened to me because I got to work in the Commander's Action Group for the Chief of Staff of the Army, and it was probably one of the best assignments I ever had. And so there have been tensions, that's one example. But it all works out in the end because it's about family and it's about teamwork and it's about helping each other, help them achieve their objectives in life.
And there's a certain element of luck, I guess, right?
There is a lot of luck.
And you make your luck, but also...
There is a lot of luck. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's wonderful. I also have a wonderful marriage, so it's been inspirational to hear you talk. So let's shift to talking about the beginning at Army Futures Command.
Okay.
And what it was like. You were there from 2018, I think, right? So
yes.
And it was established in 2019, is that right?
Yes.
So in the very beginning, your vision and General Murray's vision, you were the deputy commander. Can you tell us about, it must have been daunting. Were you excited or were you overwhelmed? And what happened in the first few days, in the early days?
Well, I would tell you, I'll go even further left of that.
Okay.
I was a commander for Army Aviation, my 2-star aviation command at the time in Huntsville, Alabama, and I got a call from General Milley to go have dinner at his house right before his confirmation. And, he was having dinner with Senator McCain and Senator Reid at the time. And the Congress was, on the Army because the Army was broke. We had spent billions and billions of dollars and had nothing to show for it. And they, you can use all the examples, whether it's FCS, Comanche, you name it. The Congress was tired of the Army, wasting the taxpayers' dollars and getting nothing in return. And General Milley at the time, told the senators, the Congress, that he was going to fix that. And there was language in the National Defense Authorization Act for all the services to develop a plan to link and streamline requirements, acquisition, science and technology, acquisition logistics. It was all stovepiped. And General Milley needed someone to do that, and he looked at the end of the table and said, Jim's going to do it, and he's moving to Washington in 2 weeks. I had never been, I'd always been in a combat unit. I had never been an acquisition officer, never been a logistician, never been a requirements generator.
Were you living in Washington?
No, I was living in Huntsville, Alabama.
2 weeks notice.
2 weeks notice to move, change command and move.
Wow.
And my wife, now the good part was my wife was in Washington working for him in LL, so now my wife and I were going to be able to be together. But I didn't understand why he picked me. And he said, because you have been the recipient and used this equipment for the last 35 years, and you used it for 7 years in combat. And you can learn all this other stuff. But they needed someone to integrate and synchronize it. And so I immediately moved to Washington, started mission analysis, looking at all the failed programs. Why did it fail? Look at the 200 different studies that we had paid for in the Army and never listened to. All right, developed, and I spent 2 years doing that. And one day, I went up to General Milley. The first thing that happened, I walked to General Milley and I said, "Sir, I've been listening and talking to your 4-stars, and they don't know what your modernization priorities are." And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "They don't know." And, we got into a little dialogue about that. I'll leave it like that. And he called them, and bottom line, the next day they had a meeting, brought all the 4-stars in and developed the modernization priorities. And then I told him, I said, "Sir, when you look at the life cycle, from the time a good idea that you need a weapon system to the time you divest it, that's about a 50, 100-year process. When you have a problem in the Army with readiness, what 4-star do you go to?" And he said, "The Force Comm Commander." When you have a problem with sustainment, what 4-star do you get? But when you have a problem with integration, synchronization, acquisition, requirements, logistics, bringing all that, who do you go to? You don't have anybody. You don't have a 4-star you can put your finger in. And really, that's why. That's why AFC. So I spent about 18 months, 2 years, and probably one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, honestly, is starting to build that headquarters. Before we stood up, there was some trying times because just like in the civilian world, I'm sure the Army has rice bowls, and this is mine, and I'm in charge of it, and don't come near it, right? But what I found was there were certain organizations in different commands that needed to come together and operate as a team, and they weren't doing that. So let's build this command. Let's take this organization from that command. Let's take this organization from that command. Let's build a team that can focus on the future of the Army. Whether it's science and technology, whether it's requirements generation, you name it. Those 4-stars didn't like that too much when you're taking organizations. It's for the good of the Army. It's not about your organization. That's how I looked at it. It caused problems, right? But I had the overhead cover of the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Secretary of the Army to make it happen, and we stood up the command, and they made the decision to they picked a commander, General Murray. I remember, I spent all this time putting the command together, and then one day the chief calls us in and says, "Murray, you're going to be the commander. Jim, you're going to be the deputy commander." And said, "You're moving to Austin."
So wait a second. Why Austin, by the way? Because there was some criticism about Austin versus Washington, or
I was not on the board. That was a separate board that picked Austin.
Okay.
There were a number of locations that we were looking at. We got down to the 5. Raleigh-Durham was one. Austin, Texas was one. San Francisco was one. Boston was one.
Interesting.
Yes, so we got it down to 5. There was a lot of political pressure placed on the Secretary McCarthy at the time. But it all came down to, hey, we're about the future of the Army. Where's tech moving? Austin became the next Silicon Valley. I mean, if you've been to Austin, that's where all the tech is. I know taxes have a lot to do with people moving out of California, but you've got all the high tech in Austin, and it was the right place to do. You don't do things, just with the defense industry. Academia is extremely important in the future of the Army. We had, the University of Texas had a lot of research going on there, Texas A&M, and because we'd been doing a lot of work, we hadn't worked with Carnegie Mellon at the time. That came later, but it was just the right place to be. So that decision was made. I'm used to living and working on an Army installation, and all of a sudden I'm working in a building owned by the University of Texas on the 19th floor, and it's just bare. And so I remember General Murray and I driving to Austin, Texas, and we're used to signing in, taking our finance records and then processing finance and then processing housing, and well, there's nothing there. We didn't even know where to turn our leave form in, so we had to build this organization from the ground up. It was so you're talking about AFC, but it's a huge acquisition and merger going on all at the same time. We went from 8 people in Army Futures Command to 26,000 people in 9 months.
Wow. That's
right?
amazing.
And standing up the headquarters and doing all the hiring, putting all the business processes, because there's never been an organization focused on the future. There are no established business processes, for this in the Army. And so it was exciting. It was slow. It was trying to, when the secretary and the chief says, this is what I want to do. Not everybody in the secretariat and the Army staff agreed.
You think?
Right. So there were bumps in the road that we had to work through, from funding to you name it. But you just, you establish a vision of where you want to take the organization and end state. You hire the right people, because everything's about people. Mm-hmm. And you've got to get the right people on the team to take the organization, and you do it together. It was just not me and General Murray going, coming up with a briefing slide that said, hey, this is where we want to take the organization. This is our vision for the future. You got to have buy-in. So we developed this plan with our people. And then, we worked extremely hard to do that. But I will tell you, in the end, you got to look at your return on investment. So Senator McCain, go back 6 years, Senator McCain and Senator Reid, say I had zero return on investment. Spent billions of dollars. It took 20 years from the time of a good idea, 3 years for the time of a good idea to actually write a requirements document. And then it took another 11 to 12 years to get the first piece of equipment into a soldier's hand. And then it took another 20 years to fully outfit the entire Army. What am I proud about think about that. 20 years, good idea, equipment in soldiers' hands. In 3 years, we were putting major weapon systems in soldiers' hands.
So what examples?
Night vision goggle, right? We established the cross-functional teams. We had one cross-functional team called Soldier Lethality. Soldier is a system. And everybody focused on, we thought we needed better night vision devices for our soldiers, because we operate at night. And normally it would take 3 years to write a requirements doc and staff it, worldwide staffing through the Pentagon, right, which takes about a year. And, every GS-12 and every major in the Army can say no. Yeah. And they all put their comments. And so I figured out a way to get around that. I only staffed my documents with those people who could say yes. Oh. And those people who could say yes are all the 4 stars. So I didn't staff any of my documents with anybody in the Army except the 4 stars. And then I'd walk in the chief and get 6 weeks, get a requirements document approved. Wow. Right? That was the lesson I learned. You only work with the people who can say yes. You don't work with the people who can say no, because everybody can say no. And they all have their pet rocks and they're all pet peeves. And so we were able to streamline our processes, our business processes. get requirements document, work with the acquisition community, work with industry and academia. That's what led us to Carnegie Mellon, right? Because you have to do it as a team. Just exciting. And this allowed us to deliver 5 major, if you look at the cross-functional teams, we stood up, you're right, 2018, 2019, we stood up, and in this year, 24 major weapon systems are being delivered to our soldiers. It started in 2019.
Wow. That must be very satisfying.
It is very sad. The return on investment has been phenomenal. I'm just, it's been an honor to serve and to be in that organization and to help lead that organization. And I will tell you that you can't do it alone. You have to work with industry and you have to work with academia. It's the 3 of us working together for the defense of our nation.
Well, what about Congress? Because one of the things that people always argue is that the acquisition system will never be fixed as long as there are strong political incentives for major platforms that are in individual constituencies. So you went to the 4 stars, but who went to Congress?
Yeah, we went to Congress too. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. I can remember when we decided on the cross-functional teams and the 5 major programs each cross-functional team would work on and bring this quickly. It just changed the whole POM, the budgeting process that had already been budgeted for over the last 5 years, that the Congress had approved, that the staffers had worked on, and trying to convince the staffers that we needed to change direction was important. But we now had a modernization priorities. Because before, the Army was just spreading the peanut butter with its money. Now we're putting our money against where the priorities were. And we were demonstrating that. And I spent days on Capitol Hill trying to convince the staffers of this, because we're going to have to reprogram money towards our priorities, towards those priority programs. And you're right, they have constituents, right? And the constituents have a lot to say. They come in right before us, and the staffers, and brief the staffers. But what you find is, any of our major weapon systems there's components made in 20 different states,
Okay.
right? So we had to show the benefit for industry. What was the benefit of industry? And so it was very interesting. It took a lot of time and energy on Capitol Hill because the Congress funds us. You can come up with the best ideas, but if you don't have the support of the United States Congress and the money, you're not going to go anywhere. So we spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and finally they came around, and then they put everything into the Defense National NDAA, and the reason we were doing it is because their bosses told us to do it, right? Senator McCain, Senator Reid, all the senators, the congressmen, and so it's worked out. There's been struggles along the way. There always is. Some industry they have what they think is important to the United States Army, and then the Army thinks what they think is important. You just got to work together.
So do you think Army Futures Command is sufficiently funded?
I can tell you at the time we were standing up the organization, I don't think we were sufficiently funded. Every 4-star command is a pretty large command. They're usually around 1,500, 2,000 people in the command. We were a flat command, 500 people, right? We had to go out and do hiring actions, and that is. And I don't think at the time we were sufficiently funded. It's come around, but we had to build a POM and start working on a 5-year plan of how we were going to fund the Army. And, were we sufficiently funding at first? No. Do I think over the years, 2 or 3 years, we started to receive the funding that we needed? Our technology was funded. Everything that we were doing in our labs was fully funded. The Congress, it was extremely important to the Congress as it relates to science and technology and RDT and research and development technology dollars. They funded us pretty well because we were able to go over and lay out a plan a plan of where we were going for the future. What are our 9 priority research areas? Why are those our 9 priority research areas? A plan to get there, bringing academia and industry into the picture. And once we laid that out and the funding that required, the Congress approved it. And so I saw very quickly, if you've got a good plan, and you go over and brief them in constant communication with the Hill, things work out.
Lots of flights between Austin and
Yes,
DC.
lots of flights. Have a lot of miles.
Yeah, I can see that. Yes. Well, tell us about the inspiration for Carnegie Mellon's Army AI2C. I mean, where did that come from? Can you? I've only been here for 6 months, so tell me a little bit about the logic behind that and AI2C's job here.
Okay, so it started with for science and technology, developing our 9 priority research areas. Right? And what people don't realize is the Army we fund 283 universities every year, about $1.3 billion that go out to the universities every year to do basic science and write white papers for the Army. Once we developed our 9 priority research areas, as I said, 4 or 5 of those priority areas, AI, robotics, autonomy, the expertise resides right here, and we weren't working with Carnegie Mellon. And Secretary McCarthy and I and Doug Mattey came down and said, hey, we want to put more money into the research in this areas. And oh, by the way, we also would like for our young officers to come here and be able to be educated here, get degrees here, and then stay here and work in this area, in the areas. And President Farnham was wonderful. He came to the meeting, and think about this. It's April. And we tell the president of Carnegie Mellon that we would like 20 of our soldiers to come get master's degrees and start in August.
Oh, man. That's really hard.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, all 20 of them started in August.
That's amazing.
And they've all 20 received their degrees since then. And they're receiving degrees from the best university in America. And then we're taking that talent, keeping them here, working with academia, working with industry as it relates to artificial intelligence. It is a model that I would recommend for any organization or any company to look at, and it's really because of the leadership of President Farnham. He is the driving force behind this. It's making a difference. We're doing things with autonomy and robotics that we never thought we could have done. I got to work with all of industry. I mean, when you look at autonomy and Elon Musk, Tesla, all of them, we're so far ahead of those guys. But we built a wonderful relationship with the university. We have an academic program. We have a training program now for our senior leaders to come here, which is extremely important. And this is a wonderful relationship. And if it wasn't for this university just bending over backwards to help us, this never would have happened. And I really appreciate the support that President Farnham gave the Army, because it is our center of excellence for artificial intelligence for the United States Army. That's a big deal, becoming a center of excellence. We're the only service to do. The Navy, we tried to bring the Navy and the Air Force in, but for some reason they went a different direction. But we're the only service doing this. And our return on investment has just been tenfold. I mean, I could go down, accomplishment after accomplishment. But in the end, it's about people. And we've had young soldiers, married soldiers, graduate, get master's degree and PhDs, from Carnegie Mellon University. And they're applying what they've learned here to the problems that we're dealing with in the Army. So that's really how I got started.
Wow, that's wonderful. That's a win-win. So I'm just curious, with all of the publicity about artificial intelligence lately, what are your thoughts, given that you've been working in this field and cooperating with our university and also, AI2C, the Army Artificial Intelligence Integration System? There's a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of general fear, there's also excitement. Any thoughts about
All the
how
above.
this has all come about, generative AI and all the rest of it?
The bottom line is, from a military perspective, there's always going to be the commander in the loop making the final decision. Period. What we're trying to do is speed up the process. Let me give you a perfect example. Today, without artificial intelligence, when we're at our training centers, and we send units to go train, brigades, which is about 5,000 people, to the training center out in California, and then we have an opposing force, right? And we do battle against each other for 30 days, and we take those lessons learned. And as it relates to artificial intelligence, it's about speed.
Yes.
Right? And it's from sensor, from the time you see a bad guy to the time you pull the trigger or the lanyard or whatever. And so on average, out at the National Training Center, from the time one of our forward observers would see the opposing force till the time that information could get back to our shooters to shoot, whether it's artillery, Apaches, or whatever, was about 14 minutes. 14 minutes is too long. Yeah. We want sensor to shooter be in seconds. And we were able to get it down to 25 seconds. Because when you see, an opposing force or a bad guy, 15 minutes later, they're not going to be where you thought they were, right? It's all about speed. And AI is helping with that. We've done so much work in that. AI as it relates to robotics. And this university, with the NREC here, being able to, in the next conflict, you've got to preserve your combat power. And you'd rather have a robot doing something than a person, right? Or you'd rather have a UAV than a helicopter. And so what this university working with the Army has done with the robotics is unbelievable. I mean, and within a year and a half, they've done things that we didn't think would be accomplished for 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 years, a decade.
Well, you were an Apache helicopter pilot. That group of folks might have some reservations about being replaced by UAVs. Any thoughts on that?
There's always going to be, that's the thing about the Army. You're right. There's been a lot of discussion on that, right? But you still have to maintain, you can have a UAV, etc., but you're looking through a little stovepipe. I mean, you are looking through a telescope, you're looking through a soda straw.
Yeah.
When you don't have a man or a woman in the loop, you lose situational awareness, you lose situational curiosity. You're not able to go out and really see the entire battlefield, because when a UAV flies, he's only looking at this spot on the ground. Maybe he'll move to this spot. When you have a human in the loop, that's why you do man-to-man teaming. And that's where the Army's focused, to do both. Where I'm getting the picture in my helicopter of what it's seeing, I'm seeing with my own eyes what I'm seeing across the battlefield. So the way we look at it is that you need both. You need both man and unmanned teaming, and that's the future. I mean, and as it relates to Blackhawks or Apache or Chinooks, carrying soldiers, I don't know if our infantry soldiers are ready to get in the back of a helicopter that don't have pilots.
Yeah, trusting.
It's all about trust, right? And so there will always be a man or a woman in the loop in our Army, because it's about trust. Right, and all of us know, I'm sure people have read about trust and all the issues, and there's issues you work through. But AI is going to benefit. Robotics is going to benefit the United States Army. we work through the ethics of that and talk about that all the time. But it comes down to trust, and we always, from a military perspective, there's always going to be a man in the loop. We all on our Apaches today, I can pick up 1,200 targets on my radar in a second. It sends it right down to my, weapon system, spins up my missile, and I can pull the trigger and never see the target. But we don't do that. We have to visually identify that that is a friend or that is a foe. So we have that capability today. But, the way the Army, there'll always be a commander, a man in the loop making that decision. It'll just be made much faster.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Department of Defense, particularly the Office of the Secretary of Defense, just came out with new guidance last January about responsible AI. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about the restrictions that the department has in place, the guidance for ethical and political and also legal reasons in using AI in combat?
I think it's necessary. I do, because when you're in combat, you're just not in an open desert where here are the bad guys rolling down the desert, and here we are, and we're going to meet in the middle.
Well, not since Desert Storm.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you're operating in towns, you're operating in cities. Mm-hmm. Civilian casualties are extremely important. That we don't, we're an army with ethics. So, we don't want to harm civilians, and so it's all about trust, right? But in the end, it's about that commander making a decision with the information that's available to him. But in the end, it's a man in the loop making the decision, not a machine. The machine aids the decision making, but in the end, it's about that, because we don't want to injure, harm, have civilian casualties on the battlefield.
Isn't that a particularly important element when it comes to democracies? Because if you're looking at authoritarian regimes, the argument is that many people argue that the PLA has no limitations on their use of AI. And so that the PLA could be much faster if we were to get into some conflict, God forbid, and that the United States would be hampered by the kinds of restrictions that we have. What do you think about that argument?
No, we have a code of conduct in DOD, in our Army, right? And we live by that code of conduct. And yeah, it may hamper a little bit. We faced this already in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the code of conduct. And it's just, we'll work our way through it. And I'm sure they are, now that I'm a civilian looking, and I'm probably not as up to speed on some of the DOD policies they're working right now and what's coming out as it relates to artificial intelligence. We worked very hard before I retired on the ethical aspect of artificial intelligence. But I'm sure, yes, you're right. Other countries don't have the same ethics or the code of conduct that we have, and it'll be much different. And so, just not the way we're raised.
Yeah, and the United States has always tried to retain the support of its people. So
That's
this
right.
is an important aspect to that. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you is, you just mentioned how this could hamper someone in combat. And this brings me back to thinking about the fact that you've commanded soldiers in combat 7 different times. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there any sort of either story or, any moment that you found either the most difficult or the most inspiring, anything that you'd like to share with us about your combat experience?
Well, I will tell you that it was an honor to be able to serve and command our soldiers in combat on 7 different occasions. We have the greatest soldiers in the world, but it all comes back down to people, right? And people are the centerpiece of what we do for our nation every day. I've had the opportunity, some hard times. Unfortunately, I've had to put 267 of my soldiers on an airplane back to Dover, Delaware over those last few years, of the 7 years. That's not fun. That's not fun when your soldiers get injured. But we've had some good times. I will tell you an interesting story about that was very interesting, probably the most nervous I ever was in the Army, is when we crossed the berm into Iraq in 2003. My wife was a battalion commander in the 101st Airborne Division, Black Hawk Battalion commander. I was an Apache Battalion commander. And as we crossed the berm and we started to move north, and one night they had, we always worked for our infantry, the guys on the ground, the infantry brigades. They chopped me under operational control to the 2nd Brigade combat team that I hadn't worked with before, and said, Jim, go support them. They're about to do an attack north, a big air assault, putting 5,000 soldiers in helicopters and moving them, to Baghdad as we moved up through the desert. And it was about 8 o'clock at night. I flew my Apache over there, linked up with the brigade commander. And then Laura, my wife, flew in, and I said, what are you doing here? And she goes, well, we're going to do the air assault. I'm going to be the air mission commander, and we're in charge of this air assault, and you're going to work for me, right? And my job, so Laura had about 100 helicopters with 5,000 people. She was in charge of, doing the big air assault just south of Baghdad. My job was to protect her. Right? So I was flying the Apaches, going in front of them, setting the conditions that the landing zones would be clear and these guys wouldn't get shot up. And it was, I remember coming out of the brief and going back to my battalion and saying, okay, guys, tomorrow morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, we're doing this big air assault in Baghdad. And they're all excited. And I said, well, and they said, who we're doing it with? And I said, with Laura. And I went, wow. And I remember, we had 24 Apaches in a battalion, and sometimes you had maintenance issues. But for some reason that day, 24 Apaches were flying. Wow. Right? And I was talking to my wife on the mission, and what was so funny was I got shot during that mission, and one of my engines went out, and she had to escort me back as a Black Hawk pilot. General Milley tells the story all the time. So that was an interesting time in combat when you're doing missions with your wife, at the front. I've had the opportunity to lead soldiers at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, where you've probably heard of Operation Anaconda. You've probably heard of Tora Bora, all the major operations. I spent a lot of years in Afghanistan, so I've been a part of all the major operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. But those are some of the best times of my life in combat. The camaraderie you establish with the soldiers, you'll keep, in the friendship you'll keep for the rest of your life. But more important, for those soldiers that you lose, right, and that were severely injured, you keep them as friends for the rest of their life, and make sure you're checking up on them as well. And I continue to do that to this day. And so it was a wonderful career. I cherish those times in combat more than anything, because of the friend and you become very close when you're doing missions together, and things get a little dicey, and get heated. But you got to do it as a team. And I'm trying to think of any other, but that's about it as far as combat. I just enjoyed every mission. I've got a lot of hours flying on combat missions, and I've got a lot of days on the ground with our soldiers. And we've got to look at the technology. How do we lighten the load, right, for our soldiers? I remember humping at 9,000-foot mountains with a 80-pound rucksack on my back, and what do I've got? I got a bunch of batteries for my radio and for my night vision goggles. So how do we extend the life on a battery so we don't have to take as many batteries? That all weighs down on soldiers. You've got bullets, you've got food, you've got water, You've got to look at the soldiers as a system. And so that's what technology is all about. It's more than just UAVs and that. You got to look at the soldier as well. So that's what this great university does, and it's just an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we are thrilled and honored to have you here.
Well, thank you.
So I want to thank you for that and for all of the other things that you've done. And I hope that we can continue to work well together in the future.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate this morning being able to have a conversation, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you.
Okay.